Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 1890s New York City. The gaslights are just coming on along Broadway. Horse-drawn carriages clatter over cobblestone. And in a modest brownstone on East 23rd Street, a man in a starched collar climbs the stairs to what the brass plaque downstairs advertises as a Turkish bath and massage establishment. The door closes behind him. Inside, the air is thick with steam and something else. Possibility. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight we say their names out loud because they could not. I am Julian, and this is Gay Timeline, the channel that brings forgotten gay history back into the light, one quiet night at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be. A quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a gay man in Gilded Age New York? An era of unimaginable wealth and brutal Victorian morality. Have you ever wondered where men found each other when simply existing as gay could destroy your life? What happened behind the frosted glass doors of those establishments that advertised therapeutic massage but offered something far more dangerous and necessary? How did they survive in a city that criminalized their desires while simultaneously providing the anonymity to pursue them? Who were the entrepreneurs who built these spaces, knowing they were risking everything? What did the massage parlors actually look like inside? The rooms, the men, the whispered arrangements. And what happened when the police came knocking? Congratulations, you have just arrived at the corner of Broadway and 23rd Street in Manhattan in the year 1892. You are wearing a wool suit that costs more than a factory worker earns in 6 months. You are respectable. You are invisible. Let us see if you can survive. The Gilded Age earned its name honestly. Gilded, not golden. A thin layer of shine covering something far messier underneath. Mark Twain coined the term in 1873, and he meant it as an insult. This was an era of astonishing fortunes, built on the backs of astonishing misery. The Vanderbilts threw costume balls that cost $250,000, while immigrants starved in tenements 6 blocks away. It was an age of marble mansions and open sewers, of opera houses and opium dens, of strict Victorian morality and even stricter hypocrisy. And if you were a man who desired other men, it was an era of impossible contradictions. On one hand, the law was merciless. New York's sodomy statute, revised in 1886, carried a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. 20 years. Not for the act itself necessarily, proving that in court was difficult, but for what the law called crimes against nature, a phrase so vague it could mean nearly anything the prosecutor wanted it to mean. A touch, a letter, a glance held too long. On the other hand, the city itself offered something no previous generation of gay men had ever experienced at this scale. Anonymity. New York in the 1890s was exploding. The population had nearly doubled in 2 decades. Immigrants poured off ships at Castle Garden and later Ellis Island, Italians, Irish, Germans, Russian Jews, Poles, everyone trying to vanish into the crowd and reinvent themselves. And if immigrants could vanish, so could you. A young man from Ohio or Georgia could step off the train at Grand Central, check into a boarding house, and simply disappear into the great roiling mass of humanity. No one knew your family. No one knew your past. You were whoever you claimed to be. The historian George Chauncey spent years in the archives reconstructing gay New York during this period, and what he found was astonishing. A vast, hidden world. Not a single neighborhood, though certain areas became known, but an entire secret city layered on top of the visible one. Bathhouses, saloons with back rooms, certain corners of Central Park after dark, the third balcony at the opera, the YMCA on 23rd Street, and the massage parlors. Let us be clear about what these establishments were. They advertised therapeutic services, Swedish massage, Turkish baths, hydrotherapy, perfectly legitimate in theory. Plenty of straight men visited massage parlors for actual muscle relief after a long day. The Gilded Age was obsessed with physical culture and bodily health. Gymnasiums were opening across the city, and wealthy men genuinely believed that a good rub-down could cure everything from gout to neurasthenia. But some massage parlors offered additional services, and some catered almost exclusively to a clientele of men who arrived alone and left quietly. The line between legitimate business and sexual commerce was deliberately blurred. That was the entire point: plausible deniability. If the police raided, the owner could point to the license on the wall, the medical certificates, the entirely respectable signage. Just a bathhouse officer, just men getting clean. The most famous, or infamous, depending on your perspective, was the establishment run by a man named Charles Gardiner. Gardiner operated what he called the Artistic Baths at 211 East 23rd Street from approximately 1888 until the police shut him down in 1896. We know about Gardiner because he was arrested and the trial transcripts survived. The New York District Attorney was deeply frustrated by how difficult it was to prosecute him. Gardiner never admitted anything. His employees never admitted anything. The clients certainly never admitted anything. But everyone knew. The transcripts describe a 3-story brownstone, the ground floor, a waiting room, tastefully decorated with Turkish carpets and potted palms. Calming, respectable. A clerk at a desk who took your name, or the name you gave, and your payment. $3 for a standard bath and massage. $5 for the deluxe. What made it deluxe was not specified in writing. The second floor, treatment rooms. Small, private, each with a massage table, a cabinet of oils and towels, and a door that locked from the inside. The walls were painted a deep green. The lighting was low. Gas lamps, not electric. Electricity was still new in the 1890s, and most establishments stuck with the softer glow of gas. The third floor, living quarters for some of the staff. Young men, mostly in their 20s, who worked as masseurs. The trial documents name 5 of them: William Darcy, age 24, Frank Holloway, age 22, James O'Connell, 26, Peter Van der Meer, 23, August Klein, 27. We know their names because the prosecution tried to flip them, offered immunity in exchange for testimony. Not one of them took the deal. They went to jail rather than testify against Gardiner or against each other. The judge called them depraved. The newspapers called them worse. But they kept their mouths shut. That is loyalty. Or perhaps it was love. The trial records hint at something the prosecutor could not quite articulate: that this was not just a business arrangement. These men lived together, ate together, covered for each other when clients grew aggressive or when the vice squad came sniffing around. One witness described walking past the building late at night and hearing laughter from an upstairs window. Laughter, not transaction, not secrecy. Just the sound of men who felt, for a few stolen hours, safe enough to laugh. Walk in with me. It is a cold Tuesday evening in November 1892. You have spent the entire day at your job as a clerk in a shipping firm downtown. You are 28. You have been in New York for 3 years, ever since you left your family in Philadelphia under the polite fiction that you were pursuing better professional opportunities. Your mother writes you letters asking when you will marry. You do not answer that question. You have heard about the artistic baths from a man you met, very briefly, very carefully, at a concert in Union Square. He did not say what happened there. He simply said the name of the place and the street. That was enough. You climb the steps. The door is heavy, solid. You hesitate. This is the moment. Once you walk through, you cannot pretend you stumbled in by accident. You are making a choice. You walk through. The clerk at the desk does not look up immediately. He is young, maybe 20, with dark hair parted severely to one side. When he does look up, His eyes meet yours for just a fraction of a second longer than normal. A flicker of recognition. Not that he knows you, but that he knows why you are here. Your name, sir? You give a name, not your real one. He writes it in a ledger without comment. $3, please. You pay. He hands you a key on a brass fob. Room 4, second floor. Your masseur will join you shortly. You climb the stairs. The carpet muffles your footsteps. There is music coming from somewhere, faint. A piano. Chopin, maybe. The air smells of lavender oil and coal smoke and something else. Something human. Sweat. Skin. Life. Room 4 is small. The massage table is draped in clean white linen. There is a chair in the corner, a wash basin, a mirror on the wall, which you avoid looking into because you are not ready to see your own face right now. You wait. The door opens. A young man steps in. He is blonde, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that would be called handsome in any era. He is wearing simple clothes, a collarless shirt, dark trousers. He smiles. It is a professional smile, but there is warmth in it. Good evening. I am Peter. Peter van der Meer. You do not know his name yet, but you will read it in the newspapers 4 years from now when he is sentenced to 6 months on Blackwell's Island for crimes against nature. Right now, he is just a young man offering you a massage. He gestures to the table. You undress. This is terrifying. You have never undressed in front of another man like this, not since boarding school, and that was different. That was innocent. This is not innocent. But Peter does not leer. He does not rush you. He simply waits, patient, until you are ready. You lie face down on the table. The linen is cool against your skin. Peter's hands are warm. He starts with your shoulders. The muscles are tight. Years of sitting at a desk, hunched over shipping manifests. He works the knots methodically, skillfully. For the first few minutes, this could genuinely be therapeutic. This could be exactly what the sign downstairs promised. Then his hands move lower. Slowly, your spine, the small of your back. He pauses, waiting for permission. You do not say anything, but you do not tense. You do not pull away. That is permission enough. What happens next is not described in the trial transcripts because no one testified to specifics. What we know is this. The rooms were private, the doors locked, and the men who visited the artistic baths came back, again and again. They paid $5 when 3 would have bought them a legitimate massage anywhere else in the city. They climbed those stairs in the cold and the rain and the snow, because what they found inside was worth the risk. The historian Michael Sibalis, working on similar establishments in Paris during the same period, found police reports that described these spaces as providing not just sexual encounters, but something rarer: intimacy, touch, the experience of being held. For men who spent every other hour of their lives hiding, performing heterosexuality, maintaining the mask of respectability, these rooms offered a few stolen minutes of being seen. You leave an hour later. Peter walks you to the door of the room. He does not say anything about seeing you again. He does not need to. You both know you will be back. Downstairs, the clerk hands you your coat and hat. You step out into the November night. 23rd Street is loud with traffic. A streetcar rattles past. Somewhere, a vendor is selling roasted chestnuts. The world is exactly as you left it, except you are different now. The Artistic Baths was not the only establishment of its kind. Across Manhattan in the 1890s, there were at least a dozen similar places operating at any given time. Some were more discreet than Gardner's, some were less. The Lafayette Baths on Lafayette Street, the Imperial on West 14th, the Everard, which opened in 1888 and would survive in various forms until a fatal fire in 1977, nearly 90 years of serving gay men in New York. The Everard is worth pausing on. It was enormous. 4 stories. Steam rooms, swimming pool, private cubicles, a dormitory floor where you could rent a bed for the night. The historian Alan Baroob, who documented gay bathhouses across America, called the Everard the single most important queer space in New York before Stonewall. Generations of men passed through those doors. In the 1890s, it advertised itself as a health club. By the 1920s, everyone knew what it really was. By the 1970s, it did not bother pretending. But in 1892, discretion was survival. The economics of these places were fascinating. A legitimate bathhouse could turn a modest profit. Hygiene was a real concern in an era before most apartments had running hot water. But a bathhouse that also functioned as a sexual meeting ground could charge premium rates and ensure loyal repeat customers. Gardner's artistic baths brought in roughly $1,000 a month, according to financial records entered as evidence during his trial. That is the equivalent of about $30,000 today. Not a fortune, but a very comfortable living. More important than the money was the risk. Operating one of these establishments was not technically illegal. Massage and bathing were legal services. But the moment the business could be proven to facilitate sodomy, the owner faced arrest, public humiliation, prison, and financial ruin. The police knew these places existed. The newspapers knew. Everyone knew. But proving what happened behind closed doors was nearly impossible unless someone talked. And no one talked. The code of silence around gay spaces in this era was ironclad. When the police raided the artistic baths in February 1896, they arrested Gardner, all 5 masseurs, and 11 clients who happened to be on the premises. Not one of the clients testified. Several were prominent men, a banker, a lawyer, a stockbroker, a professor at Columbia. The prosecutor offered them immunity. They refused. They chose public scandal over betraying the space that had sheltered them. 3 of them lost their jobs anyway, just from the association. The banker's name appeared in the New York Herald under the headline "Degenerates Discovered in Raid on Broadway Vice Den." He was fired the next day. He left the city. We do not know what happened to him after that. The lawyer, a man named Edwin Turnbull, actually fought back. He sued the Herald for libel, arguing that his presence at the baths proved nothing. He had gone there for a legitimate massage and had no knowledge of any immoral activity. The case went nowhere, but the audacity is striking. In an era when most gay men arrested in raids simply vanished into shame, Turnbull stood in a courtroom and said, "Prove it." They could not prove it. He still lost his reputation. Charles Gardner himself was convicted under a vague public morals statute, not for sodomy, but for keeping a disorderly house. He served 18 months in Sing Sing. When he was released, he left New York and moved to San Francisco, where he opened another bathhouse under a different name. That one lasted until the 1906 earthquake destroyed half the city. Gardner died in 1911. His obituary in the San Francisco Call described him as a businessman and fitness enthusiast. It made no mention of what his business actually was. History is kind to some men and merciless to others, and the difference often comes down to who wrote the obituary. The massage parlors themselves occupied a strange place in the moral geography of Gilded Age New York. They were not brothels. Those were a different world entirely, mostly serving heterosexual clients and staffed by women. They were not the rough trade bars down by the docks where working-class men met for quick, anonymous encounters. The massage parlors were middle-class spaces, respectable, or at least respectable adjacent. You wore a suit. You paid in cash. You did not make a scene. This class dimension mattered enormously. A poor man caught in a sodomy scandal might be thrown in jail and forgotten. A middle-class man, a clerk, a schoolteacher, a shopkeeper, might lose his job but could relocate and rebuild. A wealthy man often faced no legal consequences at all because wealth bought silence. The massage parlors catered to men who had just enough money to afford discretion, but not enough to be untouchable. The interactions inside these spaces were shaped by that class reality. You did not show up drunk. You did not proposition the masseur crudely. There was a script, unspoken, but universally understood. You asked for a massage. The masseur provided one. If something more developed, it developed through implication, through silence, through the gradual crossing of boundaries that both parties had agreed to without ever saying so aloud. This drove the authorities absolutely insane. The district attorney who prosecuted Gardner complained in court that these places were impossible to regulate precisely because nothing explicit ever happened in the open. No money changed hands for sex specifically. It was all bundled into the massage fee. No one solicited openly. The masseurs were not prostitutes in any legal sense, because they were employed as masseurs and their contract said nothing about additional services. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, called it a pernicious evil cloaked in the language of health and respectability. He was right. That was exactly what it was, and that was why it worked. The men who worked in these establishments occupied a precarious position. They were not free in any meaningful sense. Most were young, often immigrants or men from poor backgrounds, who needed the money and had few other options. But neither were they victims in the simple sense that Victorian morality preferred. The trial transcripts and newspaper accounts try very hard to paint them as either corrupted innocents or depraved criminals, and the truth was neither. Take Peter van der Meer, whose hands you felt in that room upstairs. We know more about him than the others because he gave a statement to his lawyer that was preserved in the case files. He was born in Amsterdam in 1869, came to New York in 1887 at age 18, spoke almost no English, found work as a porter in a hotel, then as a waiter, then as a bath attendant at a legitimate establishment on the Bowery. Charles Gardner hired him in 1890 because he was strong, clean-cut and willing to work nights. Did Peter know what he was signing up for? His statement is maddeningly vague. He describes the work as massage therapy. He insists he never broke the law. But then there is this line, buried in the middle of the document. I provided comfort to men who had no other place to find it. That is not the language of someone oblivious. Peter was arrested 3 times between 1890 and 1896. Twice the charges were dropped for lack of evidence. The 3rd time, after the big raid, he went to Blackwell's Island for 6 months. The jail records describe him as unrepentant. He refused to name clients. He refused to express shame. The warden wrote that van der Meer maintained an attitude of defiance wholly inappropriate to his situation. Good for him. When Peter was released, he did not leave New York. He stayed, opened a small tailor shop on Mulberry Street. The historian George Chauncey found a business listing for van der Meer tailoring in the 1898 City Directory. It vanishes from the records after 1901. We do not know if he died, moved, or simply faded into the anonymity he had lost during the trial. But for 11 years, he lived openly in a city that had tried to destroy him. That takes a particular kind of courage. The other masseurs from the artistic baths scattered. James O'Connell went back to Ireland. August Klein moved to Chicago. Frank Holloway stayed in New York but changed his name. Census records suggest he became Francis Howard and worked as a barber in the Bronx until at least 1920. Only William Darcy seems to have vanished completely. No records, no trail. Either he left the country or he buried himself so deep in a new identity that history lost him. Men like these were the skeleton crew of gay New York. They kept the spaces open. They took the risks. They absorbed the arrests and the public humiliation so that other men with more money, more status, more ability to disappear, could have a few hours of safety. It was not a fair arrangement. It was never a fair arrangement. The clients who visited the artistic baths were clerks and shopkeepers and bookkeepers, yes, but they were still a rung above the men who worked there. When the police came, the clients could afford lawyers. The masseurs could not. The clients had families who might stand by them. The masseurs were often alone in a new country with no one to vouch for them, and yet the system held. Because even within that unfair arrangement, there was solidarity. The men who visited these places understood, at least dimly, that they owed their safety to the men who worked there. That is why so many refused to testify. That is why the code of silence held, even when the prosecutors offered immunity, offered money, offered a way out. They were all in it together. That was the unspoken truth. The client in the expensive suit and the masseur with the immigrant accent were both one arrest away from ruin, both one newspaper headline away from losing everything. The class difference mattered, but the shared vulnerability mattered more. Let us talk about what actually happened in those rooms, because the euphemisms can only carry us so far. The trial transcripts dance around the subject. The newspapers use phrases like unspeakable acts and depraved behavior and leave the details to the imagination of their scandalized readers. But we can reconstruct the reality from what survived. Court testimonies that tried very hard not to say anything specific, medical examiner reports that said too much, and the occasional detailed statement from a man who decided he had nothing left to lose. One such statement comes from a client arrested during a raid on a different bathhouse, the Imperial, in 1894. His name was George Merritt, and he was a 32-year-old accountant. He gave a full confession to his lawyer in exchange for a plea deal, and the lawyer kept a copy. It surfaced in an archive at the New York Public Library in the 1980s, and George Chauncey quotes from it in his work on gay New York. Merritt describes visiting the Imperial once or twice a month for about 2 years. He would arrive in the evening after work, pay his fee, be shown to a private room. A masseur, he names several, though we will spare their reputations, would join him. They would talk first, small talk, the weather, the city. How was business? This was not foreplay in the sexual sense. It was foreplay in the human sense. A brief reminder that they were two people, not just bodies in a transaction. Then the massage would begin, and Merritt is precise about this. It started as a real massage. The masseur was skilled. He knew anatomy. He worked the muscles properly. For 10 or 15 minutes it was entirely therapeutic. Then the touch would shift, lighter, slower, more intentional. And if Merritt responded, if he relaxed further, if his breathing changed, the masseur would continue. If Merritt tensed or pulled away, the masseur would return to the therapeutic script. No words, no negotiation, just attention to the smallest physical cues. What followed varied. Sometimes it was simply touch, hands moving over skin in ways that had nothing to do with muscle relief. Sometimes it was mutual. Sometimes one of them would climax, and sometimes neither would, and it did not particularly matter, because the point was not the climax. The point was the contact, the warmth, the fact of being touched by another man without shame, without hurry, without fear. Afterward, they would talk again. Merritt describes lying on the table, still undressed, while the masseur sat in the chair and smoked a cigarette and told him about his week. One masseur had a sister in Pennsylvania he was trying to bring to New York. Another was saving money to open a restaurant. Another was in love with a woman but could not afford to marry her. These men were not one-dimensional. They were not symbols. They were humans trying to survive in a city that gave them very few options and even fewer safe spaces. Some of them were gay, some were not. Some were doing this work because it was the only way to make rent. Some were doing it because they genuinely liked the intimacy, the quiet connection with another person in a world that was otherwise brutal and lonely. Merritt's confession ends with a line that the prosecutor tried to have stricken from the record but failed. I never hurt anyone. I never forced anyone. I paid for a service that brought comfort to myself, an income to men who needed it. If that is a crime, then half of New York is guilty. He was not wrong. The geography of these establishments tells its own story. Most were clustered in Manhattan below 42nd Street, in neighborhoods that were commercial and anonymous. 23rd Street, where the artistic bath stood, was a bustling corridor of shops and theaters and hotels. No one noticed one more brownstone with a discreet brass plaque. The Everard was on West 28th, near the Tenderloin, a district known for vice of all kinds, which meant the bathhouse blended into the background noise of moral panic. A few were farther uptown, near the new developments going up along Central Park. These catered to wealthier clients and charged higher fees. They advertised in newspapers, sometimes with coded language that anyone in the know would recognize. Discreet services for gentlemen, private appointments available, European-trained staff. European-trained was code. It signaled a certain worldliness, a sophistication, an understanding that the continent had a more relaxed attitude toward these matters than puritanical America. Whether the masseurs were actually European-trained or just European surnamed did not particularly matter. The implication was enough. Some bathhouses operated out of hotels. The Grosvenor Hotel on Fifth Avenue had a basement-level bath that functioned as a semi-public cruising space for decades. Men would check into rooms upstairs for appearances, then slip downstairs to the baths. Hotel staff were paid to look the other way. This was common. The line between legitimate hospitality business and active facilitation of gay encounters was porous and profitable. The most dangerous places were not the massage parlors at all, but the public baths. New York had dozens of municipal bathhouses built in the 1880s and 1890s as a public health measure. Poor neighborhoods often lacked indoor plumbing, so the city opened free or low-cost baths where working men could wash. These were not designed as gay spaces, but anywhere men gathered naked, some men would find each other. The police knew this and raided the public baths regularly. The arrest records are grim. Men caught in what the reports called compromising positions in the steam rooms or the showers. Often, these men were immigrants, laborers, men who could not afford the privacy of the commercial massage parlors. They faced harsher sentences than the middle-class men arrested at places like the artistic baths, because they had no money for lawyers and no social standing to protect them. Between 1890 and 1900, the New York Police Department arrested approximately 400 men on sodomy-related charges connected to bathhouses. That number comes from police ledgers preserved at the municipal archives. 400 men. Most served time on Blackwell's Island or in the Tombs. Many were deported if they were immigrants. Some were sent to asylums on the theory that sexual deviance was a mental illness, curable by isolation and hard labor. It was not curable. It was not an illness. But that did not stop the doctors from trying. The medical establishment in the 1890s was obsessed with homosexuality, though they did not use that word yet. It was still too new, too clinical. The term had been coined in Germany in 1869, but did not enter common English usage until the early 1900s. In the 1890s, American doctors called it sexual inversion or contrary sexual feeling, or sometimes just degeneracy. The theory, such as it was, held that inverts were biologically distinct from normal men. Something in the body had gone wrong. An imbalance of humors, a malformation of the brain, a hereditary taint. The solution was medical intervention, cold baths, electrical shocks, enforced abstinence, chemical castration in extreme cases. None of it worked, obviously, but it gave the authorities a scientific veneer for what was really just moral punishment. Some doctors were more humane. Havelock Ellis, the British sexologist, published his groundbreaking Sexual Inversion in 1897. It was banned in England, but circulated in America. Ellis argued that inversion was a natural variation, not a disease. He interviewed dozens of gay men and found them to be, in his words, otherwise normal in every respect. He advocated for legal tolerance, if not full acceptance. Ellis's work was read by some of the men who visited places like the artistic baths. We know this because George Merritt mentions it in his confession. He had read Ellis and found it a profound relief to see his own experiences described without condemnation. Other men mention Ellis in letters that survived. It was a lifeline. The first major scientific work to say, "You are not sick, you are not broken, you are simply different." But Ellis was one voice among many, and the dominant medical opinion remained hostile. The American physician Irving C. Rosser wrote in 1892 that sexual perverts represented a threat to the social fabric and should be identified and isolated before they could corrupt the young. Rosser specifically cited bathhouses and massage parlors as vectors of contagion, places where the disease of inversion spread from one man to another. This contagion theory was everywhere in the 1890s. The idea that homosexuality was not inborn but acquired, transmitted through exposure like tuberculosis or cholera. If a young man visited a bathhouse and encountered an invert, he might himself become inverted. The solution was quarantine. Shut down the bathhouses. Arrest the inverts. Break the chain of transmission. It did not work, of course. You cannot quarantine desire. You cannot arrest your way out of human sexuality. But they tried. They tried very hard. The Reverend Charles Parkhurst was a Presbyterian minister in New York who made it his personal mission to expose vice in the city. In 1892, he delivered a series of sermons attacking the police for tolerating gambling dens, brothels, and what he called dens of male depravity. Parkhurst actually went undercover, dressed in shabby clothes, visited the Tenderloin, walked into bathhouses with a private detective he had hired. His published account, later turned into a pamphlet called Our Fight with Tammany, describes entering a bathhouse on West 14th Street and witnessing men in various states of undress engaging in behavior he could not bring himself to describe in print. He reported it to the police. The police did nothing. So Parkhurst went to the newspapers. The resulting scandal forced the police to act. A series of raids in early 1893 shut down half a dozen bathhouses temporarily. Dozens of men were arrested. The newspapers had a field day. The New York World ran a front-page story headlined, "The Secret Vice of the City Exposed," complete with lurid illustrations of men in towels fleeing police. But here is the thing about moral panics. They are very loud and very brief. Within 6 months, most of the bathhouses had reopened under new names or in new locations. The Artistic Baths, which had been raided in March 1893, was operating again by June. Charles Gardner paid a fine, replaced his staff, and kept going. Because the demand did not disappear. The men who needed these spaces did not stop needing them just because a minister gave a sermon. If anything, the publicity made certain men more aware that such places existed. For every person scandalized by Parkhurst's exposé, there was another who read between the lines and thought, so that is where they are. The Reverend Parkhurst died in 1933, convinced he had cleaned up New York. He had not. The city was exactly as gay after his crusade as it had been before. He had just made it more dangerous for a while. The men who ran these massage parlors were, in their own way, radicals. They were not activists in the modern sense. They did not march. They did not publish manifestos. They did not demand rights. But they created spaces where gay men could exist, and that was a radical act in 1890s New York. Charles Gardner knew he was breaking the law. He knew he could be arrested, imprisoned, destroyed. He did it anyway. Not out of altruism necessarily, he was making money after all, but out of something deeper. He saw a need, and he filled it. He employed young men who had no other options. He provided a service that society condemned but clearly wanted, because men kept walking through his door. After Gardner was arrested and sent to Sing Sing, his sister gave an interview to the New York Tribune. She defended him, said he was a good man who had helped people. The reporter was baffled. Helped them how? She did not explain. She did not need to. She knew what her brother had done, and she was proud of him. That interview ran in April 1896, buried on page 12, 6 paragraphs long. It is one of the few times in this entire history that someone from inside the world of gay bathhouses spoke publicly without shame. She did not apologize. She did not equivocate. She said, "My brother was a good man," and then she stopped talking to reporters. Her name was Clara Gardner. She was 43. She ran a boarding house in Brooklyn. When Charles got out of prison, he stayed with her for 6 months before moving to San Francisco. She gave him the money to start over. We know this from a letter Charles wrote to a friend, preserved in a private collection and quoted by the historian Michael Bronski in his work on early gay entrepreneurship. Clara Gardiner died in 1902. Her obituary does not mention her brother. But somewhere in Brooklyn, in a boarding house that no longer stands, a woman loved her gay brother enough to stake her reputation on him. That matters. The clients themselves left very little record. Unlike the owners and the masseurs, who appeared in court documents and police ledgers, the men who visited these establishments mostly vanished into discretion. They used false names. They paid in cash. They arrived alone and left alone. The entire system was designed to protect their anonymity, and it worked. But occasionally, a client surfaced in the archives, usually because something went wrong. In 1894, a man named Theodore Ames was found dead in his apartment on Gramercy Park. He was 36 years old, unmarried, worked as an editor at a publishing house. The coroner ruled it a suicide, laudanum overdose. Among his effects, the police found a diary. The diary was not introduced as evidence at any trial because there was no trial, but it was catalogued and stored, and it survived. A researcher named Jonathan Ned Katz found it in the 1970s while working on his groundbreaking documentary history of gay America. He quotes from it extensively. Theodore Ames visited the artistic baths and several other similar establishments regularly between 1890 and his death in 1894. He wrote about these visits in careful, coded language, but the meaning is clear. He describes the relief of being touched, the terror of wanting something the world called evil, the loneliness of living a double life. One entry from March 1892 went again to the place on 23rd Street, saw the same young man as last time. We did not speak much, but I felt for an hour less alone than I have felt in months. Is it wrong to pay for kindness? I do not know. I know only that I will go back. Another from July 1893. Read in the newspaper about the raids. They are closing the bathhouses. I do not know where I will go now. The thought of returning to the life I had before, the endless pretending, the careful lies, the performance of normalcy, fills me with a dread I cannot name. And then, heartbreakingly, from January 1894, 6 months before his death, I am tired. I have been tired for a very long time. There is no place in this world for men like me. I have tried to make peace with that. I cannot. Theodore Ames was buried in a family plot in Connecticut. His diary was returned to his sister, who burned most of it. The surviving fragments were found in a box of papers she donated to a historical society decades later, after her own death. She had kept a few pages. Perhaps she understood. Perhaps she wanted someone, someday, to know her brother had existed. He was not the only one. The historian George Chauncey estimates that between 1870 and 1900, there were at least 3,000 regular clients of gay bathhouses and massage parlors in New York. 3,000 men who visited these places often enough to be considered part of the subculture. And for every regular, there were probably 5 or 10 men who visited once or twice, out of curiosity or desperation, and then returned to their conventional lives. Some of those men were married. The diary of Theodore Ames mentions seeing men he recognized from social events. Men with wives, men with children. They did not acknowledge each other outside the bathhouse. The rule was silence. What happened inside stayed inside. This created a strange double existence. A man could be a respectable clerk or lawyer or shopkeeper by day, attending church on Sunday, courting a young woman his family approved of, and then, by night, he could slip into a bathhouse and become someone else entirely. Not a different person exactly, but a fuller version of himself, the self he could not show anywhere else. The psychological toll of that division was immense. We see it in the letters and diaries that survived. Men describe feeling fractured, hollow. They use the language of performance, playing a role, wearing a mask, acting a part. And the bathhouses and massage parlors were the only places where the mask could come off, even if just for an hour. That is what these places really sold. Not sex, though sex was part of it. They sold the experience of being whole, of not having to perform, of being seen and touched and accepted, even if that acceptance was temporary and purchased. It is easy to romanticize this. It is also easy to condemn it. The truth is messier than either romanticism or condemnation allows. These were commercial transactions taking place in a society that criminalized the desires at their core. The power dynamics were unequal. The risks were not evenly distributed. And yet within that deeply flawed system, real human connection happened. Men found each other. They found comfort. They survived. The culture of the bathhouses had its own unwritten rules. You did not ask personal questions. You did not pry into anyone's life outside the building. You did not gossip. You did not expose anyone. The code of silence was absolute, not because someone enforced it, but because everyone understood that breaking it would destroy the fragile ecosystem that allowed these places to exist. There was also a social hierarchy within the bathhouse world. Regulars were known to the staff. They received better treatment, preferred masseurs, longer sessions, small courtesies. A regular might be greeted by name, or at least by the name he used in that space. First-time visitors were handled more carefully, with extra discretion, because no one knew yet if they could be trusted. Some bathhouses had memberships. You paid an annual fee and received a token or a card that granted you access without needing to explain yourself each time. The Everard had such a system. The records were kept in code, numbers instead of names, and were destroyed regularly to avoid creating evidence. This was a world built on paranoia and trust in equal measure. Paranoia because the threat was real. One wrong word, one informant, one overzealous policeman, and the entire structure could collapse. Trust because without it, nothing could function. You had to trust that the clerk would not turn you in, that the masseur would not blackmail you, that the other clients would not recognize you on the street and ruin you. Most of the time, that trust held, but not always. Blackmail was a persistent threat. Some masseurs, particularly those who were not themselves gay and were only in the work for the money, saw opportunities. They would cultivate a relationship with a wealthy client, gather information, real name, place of employment, family details, and then demand payment for silence. The police records contain several such cases. In 1891, a masseur named Patrick Hennessy was arrested for attempting to extort $500 from a client he identified only as Mr. S. Hennessy had kept detailed notes about his encounters with Mr. S, including dates, times, and specific acts. He threatened to send the notes to Mr. S's employer and to the newspapers unless he was paid. Mr. S went to the police instead. This was an extraordinary act of courage. By reporting the blackmail, he was admitting to visiting a bathhouse and engaging in illegal acts. But he did it anyway, perhaps calculating that the risk of exposure was worth stopping Hennessy. Hennessy was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in Sing Sing. The judge, in his remarks, expressed no sympathy for Mr. S, but noted that blackmail could not be tolerated regardless of the victim's moral status. Mr. S's identity was kept sealed by the court, a rare mercy. We do not know who Mr. S was, but we know he made the choice to fight back rather than pay. That took a particular kind of defiance. Most blackmail victims did not go to the police. They paid, and paid again, and again, until they ran out of money or the blackmailer lost interest or moved on to another target. The amounts were usually small enough to be sustainable but large enough to hurt. $10 here, $20 there. Death by 1,000 cuts. Some men, when faced with blackmail, chose a different route. They disappeared, left the city, changed their names, started over somewhere else. The historian Michael Bronsky found records of men who simply vanished from New York directories in the middle of their lives, established professionals who abandoned careers, homes, families, rather than face exposure. One such man was James Whitcomb, a schoolteacher in Brooklyn, who was blackmailed by a masseur in 1895. Whitcomb paid twice, then vanished. His family reported him missing. The police found no trace of him. 20 years later, a researcher tracking another case discovered a man named James Ward, teaching in a small town in Oregon. The handwriting matched, the age matched. It was almost certainly him. He had run, and he had survived by becoming someone else entirely. How many men did that? How many James Whitcombs are buried in the archives under names that were not the ones they were born with? We will never know. The violence that sometimes erupted in and around these establishments came from multiple directions. There was violence from clients who panicked mid-encounter and lashed out. Violence from masseurs who were robbed or assaulted by clients who knew the victims could not go to the police. Violence from outsiders, gangs of young men who targeted bathhouses for sport, beating anyone they found inside because they knew no one would defend them. The police reports from this era are full of such incidents. A masseur found beaten in an alley behind the Everard in 1893. A client stabbed outside a bathhouse on the Bowery in 1895. The perpetrators were rarely caught because the victims rarely cooperated with investigations. To cooperate would mean explaining why you were there, and that was a confession most men were not willing to make. Some violence was internalized. Suicide rates among gay men in this period were certainly higher than average, though exact statistics are impossible to come by because cause of death was often obscured by families. Theodore Ames was one. There were others, men who left notes that their families destroyed, men who were found dead in rented rooms with no explanation. The few suicide notes that survived share a common theme: exhaustion. Not despair exactly, though despair was part of it, but a bone-deep weariness at the effort of living a divided life, the constant vigilance, the endless performance, the knowledge that there was no future where they could be fully themselves. One note, quoted by historian Martin Duberman, was left by a man named Samuel Pierce, who died in 1897 at age 29. I am tired of hiding. I am tired of lying. I am tired of pretending that half of myself does not exist. I cannot do it anymore. Forgive me. His family buried him without a headstone. They were ashamed. He deserved better. But there was also joy. We cannot let the violence and the tragedy eclipse the fact that these spaces also held laughter, flirtation, friendship, love. The surviving accounts are not all grim. Some are surprisingly light. George Merritt, in his confession, describes a New Year's Eve party at the Imperial Bathhouse in 1893. The place was closed to new clients for the night. The regulars were invited to stay. Someone brought champagne. Someone else brought a violin. They drank and sang and danced. Men dancing with men in a steam-filled room, while outside the city celebrated the turning of the year, oblivious. Merritt writes, "It was the happiest I have ever been. For a few hours, I was not hiding. I was not afraid. I was simply a man among men, and we were happy. I wish I could have stayed in that moment forever." He could not, of course. The party ended. The guests left. The next day, Merritt went back to his job at the accounting firm and his rented room and his carefully constructed life. But he had that night. It existed. It mattered. The bathhouses also functioned as information networks. This is often overlooked, but was crucial. In an era before gay newspapers, before organizations, before any public infrastructure for gay life, the bathhouses were where you learned things, where other safe spaces were, which bars had back rooms, which parks were safe after dark, which neighborhoods to avoid. Regulars shared this knowledge quietly, a word in passing, a name slipped into conversation. This was how gay geography was mapped and transmitted. You could walk into a bathhouse in New York knowing nothing, and walk out with a mental map of the entire hidden city. Some bathhouses had bulletin boards where clients could leave coded messages. These were usually tucked in the back, near the private rooms, where only people who knew to look would see them. The messages were brief and cryptic: an initial, a date, a place, Enough for someone to make a connection, not enough to incriminate anyone if the board was discovered. The police raided the artistic baths in 1896 and confiscated one such board. The messages were entered into evidence. The prosecution tried to use them to identify clients. They could not. The code was too opaque. The messages meant nothing to outsiders. They only made sense if you were already inside the world they referenced. One message read, J Tuesday, usual. Another, looking for P from March. Tell him R misses him. A third, anyone know where the Wednesday circle moved? They closed the old place. Translated, J is available on Tuesday at the usual meeting place. R is trying to reconnect with P, someone he met in March. A regular gathering that happened on Wednesdays has been shut down, and the group is trying to find a new location. These tiny scraps of paper are all that remain of countless human connections. Men looking for each other. Men trying to maintain friendships and relationships across a city that wanted them to be invisible. The bulletin board was their social network, their Craigslist, their lifeline. When the police destroyed the board, they destroyed more than evidence. They destroyed one of the few communication systems gay men had. But the system rebuilt. It always rebuilt. New boards appeared. New codes were developed. The network adapted and survived because it had to. The economic underpinnings of the bathhouse world were more complex than a simple exchange of money for services. Yes, clients paid fees. But there was also a parallel economy of favors, gifts, and patronage. Wealthy clients sometimes became sponsors. They would pay extra to ensure their preferred masseur was available. They would tip generously. They would bring gifts, a bottle of wine, a box of cigars, a warm coat in winter. These gifts were not entirely altruistic. They bought loyalty. They bought discretion. They bought the assurance that the masseur would remember you, would treat you well, would not look for other opportunities. Some relationships crossed from commercial into something more personal. A client and a masseur might genuinely become friends or even lovers, though this was risky for both parties. If the relationship was discovered, the client could be accused of corrupting the masseur, and the masseur could be accused of extortion. But it happened anyway. Human beings are not good at maintaining emotional boundaries when intimacy is involved. Touch leads to conversation. Conversation leads to familiarity. Familiarity leads to affection. And affection complicates everything. One of the few documented cases of a client and a masseur forming a lasting relationship comes from the papers of a man named Oliver Wendell Bennett, a lawyer who died in 1904. Among his effects was a bundle of letters from someone identified only as A. The letters span from 1891 to 1903. They are unmistakably love letters. A was almost certainly a masseur. The early letters reference their meetings in a way that suggests a commercial origin. Thank you for your generosity. I hope I provided satisfaction. But the later letters are different. They discuss moving in together, sharing a household, building a life. By 1900, the letters reference our home and our life together in ways that suggest they actually did it. The historian Lisa Duggan, who analysed these letters, argues they represent a transition from purchased intimacy to genuine partnership. A and Bennett found each other in a bathhouse, but they built something real. They were together for at least 12 years. When Bennett died, he left his estate to A, though the will obscured the relationship by listing A as a business associate. A collected the inheritance and disappeared from the records. We do not know what happened to him. But for 12 years, he and Oliver Wendell Bennett had each other. That is a victory. The legal landscape around these establishments was constantly shifting. The basic sodomy statute remained stable, 20 years maximum sentence for crimes against nature, but enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Some years the police raided bathhouses every few weeks. Other years they left them alone for months at a time. This inconsistency was not random. It reflected the politics of the moment. When reformers like Reverend Parkhurst stirred up public outrage, the police had to act. When the newspapers moved on to other scandals, the pressure eased. The bathhouses operated in the gaps between waves of moral panic. Tammany Hall, the political machine that controlled New York politics for much of this era, had a complicated relationship with Vice. On the one hand, Tammany politicians publicly supported crackdowns to appease reformers. On the other hand, Tammany enforcers collected protection money from bathhouses, brothels, and gambling dens. The money flowed up the chain. Everyone got a cut. And in exchange, the police looked the other way most of the time. This system broke down periodically when someone, usually a minister or a crusading journalist, made enough noise that ignoring it became politically impossible. Then there would be a flurry of raids, a handful of arrests, some public hand-wringing, and then everything would go back to normal. Charles Gardiner understood this. He paid his protection money regularly. He cultivated relationships with local beat cops. He made sure his establishment never became too visible, too loud, too much of a problem. That is why the artistic bath survived as long as it did. Gardiner knew how to play the game. When he was finally arrested in 1896, it was not because he had broken the unspoken rules. It was because the political winds had shifted. A new district attorney had taken office on a reform platform. He needed scalps. Gardiner was unlucky enough to be raided at exactly the wrong moment in the political cycle. If the raid had happened 6 months earlier or 6 months later, he might have walked away with a fine. Timing is everything. The physical spaces themselves were carefully designed, though not in any architectural sense. These were not purpose-built structures. They were ordinary brownstones and commercial buildings retrofitted for a specific clientele. But the modifications mattered. Privacy was the first consideration. Treatment rooms needed locks on the doors. Windows needed curtains or frosted glass. Sound carried in these old buildings. So many establishments installed extra walls or hung heavy drapes to muffle noise. Not the noise of sex necessarily, though that too, but conversation, laughter, the simple sound of men being at ease with each other. That could be just as incriminating as anything physical. The waiting areas were designed to feel respectable, clean, well lit, comfortable but not luxurious. The goal was to signal legitimacy while also providing enough comfort that a nervous first-time visitor might relax. A few chairs, a coat rack, maybe a small table with newspapers or magazines. Nothing that would look out of place in a doctor's office or a lawyer's waiting room. The treatment rooms themselves varied. Some were genuinely equipped for massage, tables, oils, linens, all the apparatus of therapeutic bodywork. Others were more makeshift. A bed, a chair, a basin of water, the minimum necessary to maintain the fiction. Lighting was kept low. Gaslight was softer than electric, which was an advantage. It created intimacy. It also made it harder for anyone to identify faces clearly, which mattered if the place was raided and witnesses were called to testify. Many clients never saw their masseur's face clearly. They knew a voice, a touch, a general impression, but not enough to pick someone out of a lineup. Temperature mattered too. These rooms were kept warm, sometimes uncomfortably so. Partly this was practical. If you were undressed, warmth was necessary, but it also created a particular atmosphere. Heat makes people drowsy, relaxed, less guarded. The steam rooms at places like the Everard were kept at temperatures that would make a modern health inspector nervous. Men sat in the steam until they were lightheaded, vulnerable, open. The smell of these places was distinct. Lavender oil was common, used for massage, but also to cover other smells: sweat, coal smoke from the heating, the mustiness of old buildings. Some establishments burned incense. Others used eucalyptus or peppermint, anything to create an environment that felt separate from the city outside. You walked in from the noise and grime of New York and entered a space that smelled clean, herbal, slightly exotic. Sound was managed carefully. Some bathhouses played music, a piano in the corner, or later, a phonograph. The music served two purposes. It created ambiance, and it provided cover. A murmured conversation under the sound of Chopin was much harder to overhear than the same conversation in silence. The Everard had a piano on the second floor that was played most evenings by a man the regulars knew only as Thomas. He was not an employee. He was a client who happened to play beautifully and who was allowed to use the piano in exchange for providing entertainment. Thomas played for years. No one knew his last name. No one asked. He would arrive in the early evening, sit down at the piano, and play until late into the night. Brahms, Schubert, popular songs of the era, anything requested. When the Everard was raided in 1903, Thomas was arrested along with everyone else present. The newspapers identified him as Thomas Whitman, a music teacher from New Jersey. He lost his job. He was not charged with any crime, but the association was enough. He disappeared from the records after that. The piano at the Everard sat silent for months until another regular took over the bench. The physical layout of these buildings also reflected the need for quick exits. Most had back doors. Some had multiple staircases. The artistic baths had a rear exit that opened onto an alley, and the door was kept unlocked during business hours. If someone shouted police, clients could slip out the back while the officers came through the front. This happened more than once. The police would arrive, bang on the door, and by the time they got inside, half the clients had vanished. The ones who remained were usually the masseurs and a few unlucky clients who had been in rooms too far from the exits. The police knew this. The raids were as much theatre as enforcement. Arrest a few men, make some headlines, prove you were doing something about vice. But no one seriously believed they were shutting down the trade. It was containment, not elimination. The economics of running a bathhouse required balancing several competing pressures. You needed to charge enough to make a profit and pay your staff, but not so much that you priced out your clientele. You needed to pay protection money to the police, which could be substantial. You needed to maintain the building, replace supplies, handle occasional legal fees when someone was arrested. Charles Gardner's financial records, entered into evidence during his trial, show that the artistic baths brought in about $1,200 a month in gross revenue. Operating costs were roughly $600. That left $600 in profit, but $300 of that went to protection payments and legal reserves. So Gardner netted about $300 a month, a comfortable middle-class income, but not a fortune. His largest expense after rent and staff was what the ledger called discretionary payments. These were bribes, not just to the police, but to neighbours who might complain, to building inspectors, to anyone who could cause problems. Gardner paid the owner of the pharmacy next door $20 a month just to keep him friendly. He paid a city clerk $15 a month to alert him if anyone filed a complaint about the building. This web of payments was standard. Every bathhouse operator had similar arrangements. You were not just running a business. You were running a small-scale protection racket in reverse, paying everyone who could hurt you to stay quiet. The staff were paid modestly. Masseurs earned about $10 a week in salary, plus tips. Tips could double that amount if the masseur was popular and the clients were generous. A top masseur at a well-established bathhouse could make $30 or $40 a week, which was very good money for a young working-class man in the 1890s. But the work was precarious. You could be arrested at any time. You had no legal protections. If a client accused you of theft or assault, your word meant nothing against his. And if the establishment was shut down, you were out of a job with no notice and no severance. Most masseurs did not stay in the work long. A year or two. Long enough to save some money, maybe learn a trade, then move on to something more stable. The men who stayed longer were either very good at it, they built a loyal client base and earned enough to make the risk worthwhile, or they had no other options. Peter van der Meer stayed for 6 years. That was unusually long. By the time he was arrested, he was the senior masseur at the artistic baths. He trained new hires. He handled difficult clients. He was trusted in a way that newer employees were not. The trial transcripts mention that van der Meer kept a private ledger with the names and preferences of regular clients. The police confiscated it, hoping to use it to identify clients for prosecution. But the ledger was in Dutch, written in a personal shorthand that no one could fully decipher. The names were abbreviations or nicknames. The preferences were coded. One entry, translated and quoted in the trial record. Mr. K, Tuesdays, quiet, neck and shoulders, careful with left arm, likes to talk about books. That was it. No full name, no address, no evidence of anything illegal. Just a masseur keeping notes on how to serve a client well. The prosecutor called it a catalogue of degeneracy. The defense called it evidence of professional diligence. The jury never saw it, ruled inadmissible because it was inconclusive. But its existence tells us something important. Vandermeer cared about doing his job well. He remembered what clients liked. He paid attention. This was not just transaction. This was craft. The relationships between masseurs could be collegial or competitive, depending on the establishment. At the artistic baths, by all accounts, the staff got along. They lived together, worked together, protected each other. At other places, there was friction. Masseurs competed for the best clients, for tips, for favor with the owner. Some establishments rotated clients randomly. You got whoever was available. Others let clients request specific masseurs. That created obvious hierarchies. The most requested masseurs had power. They could demand better pay, better hours, better treatment. The less popular ones were stuck with whoever was left, which often meant difficult clients or fewer shifts. The Diary of George Merritt mentions this. He describes requesting the same masseur repeatedly at the Imperial, then one night arriving to find the man was no longer employed there. The clerk offered someone else. Merritt tried the new masseur once and did not return to the Imperial. His loyalty was to the person, not the place. This happened a lot. Clients followed individual masseurs when they changed establishments. If a good masseur moved from one bathhouse to another, his regulars moved with him. This gave masseurs leverage. If an owner treated his staff poorly, they could leave and take the client base with them. At least one masseur, a man named Carl Jensen, actually opened his own competing bathhouse after working for several years at the Everard. Jensen's establishment was smaller, more discreet, and by all accounts, more expensive. But it succeeded because Jensen brought his clients with him. The Everard's owner was reportedly furious, but there was nothing he could do. Jensen had broken no contract. He had simply gone into business for himself. Jensen's bathhouse, located on East 18th Street, operated from 1897 to 1901. It was shut down not by police raid, but by neighbors who complained about the noise. Jensen paid a fine and closed quietly. He moved to Philadelphia and opened another bathhouse there. That one lasted until at least 1910. This pattern of mobility, masseurs moving between cities, opening new establishments, carrying knowledge and client networks with them, created a kind of informal franchise system. The same model was replicated in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. The bathhouse culture of Gilded Age New York was exported across the country by men who had learned the trade there. Some of those men became quite successful. We do not have full records, but fragmentary evidence suggests that by 1900, there were gay-oriented bathhouses in at least a dozen American cities, most of them connected by personal networks that traced back to New York. The clients, for their part, ranged across the economic spectrum, though weighted toward the middle. Very wealthy men had other options. They could afford private arrangements, a valet who was also a lover, a kept boy in a discreet apartment, travel to Europe where the laws were less harsh. The very poor often could not afford bathhouses at all. $3 for a session was a significant expense if you were earning $10 a week. The sweet spot was the clerk, the shopkeeper, the bookkeeper, the school teacher. Men who earned enough to have discretionary income, but not enough to afford private solutions. Men who lived alone or in boarding houses, with no family nearby to monitor their movements. Men who could slip out in the evening without needing to account for their time. Some clients were young, 18, 20, 25. Men who had just arrived in the city and were figuring out who they were. For them, the bathhouse was often an education. They learned what was possible. They learned they were not alone. Other clients were older, men in their 40s or 50s who had spent decades hiding and had finally found a place where they could stop. These men often became regulars in the deepest sense. They visited the same establishment at the same time every week for years. They knew the staff. They knew the other regulars. The bathhouse became a kind of social club, the only one available to them. One such regular was a man named Ambrose Hartley, a 53-year-old accountant who visited the artistic baths every Thursday evening for 7 years. We know this because when the bathhouse was raided, his name appeared in the confiscated ledger as a standing weekly appointment. The police went to his home to question him. Hartley admitted nothing. He claimed he visited for therapeutic massage to manage back pain. There was no evidence to contradict him. He was not charged, but he lost his job anyway. His employer, a shipping firm, dismissed him on the grounds that the association was damaging to the firm's reputation. Hartley died 2 years later, in 1898. He was found in his boarding house room. The death was ruled natural causes, heart failure. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field because he had no family and no money left. The newspapers did not cover his death. He was no one important, just another man who loved the wrong people and paid for it with everything. But for 7 years, every Thursday, Ambrose Hartley had one evening a week where he did not have to hide. That is what the bathhouse gave him. It was not enough to save him, but it was something. The culture inside these establishments had its own etiquette. You did not stare. You did not follow someone out to learn where they lived. You did not gossip about who you had seen. These were iron rules, and breaking them could get you banned or worse. There was also a protocol around approaching other clients. Some bathhouses had communal areas, a steam room, a lounge, a sitting area. In those spaces, eye contact was the beginning of negotiation. A glance held a moment too long. A subtle nod. That was invitation. If the other man looked away, you respected it. If he looked back, you could approach. Conversations started carefully. The weather, the city, work. Nothing personal, nothing direct. If mutual interest was established, one of you might suggest moving to a private room or simply meeting outside the bathhouse at a later time. Not all encounters led to sex. Some men visited bathhouses just to be around other men like themselves, to sit in a room and not have to perform straightness, to have a conversation where you did not have to monitor every word for accidental revelation. The historian David K. Johnson, in his work on gay social spaces, argues that these establishments functioned as what he calls counter-public spaces, places where a marginalized group could gather and create their own norms, separate from the dominant culture. The bathhouse was a miniature society with its own rules, and those rules were often more humane than the ones outside. Inside, you could be gentle, you could be vulnerable, you could admit loneliness. Outside, all of that was weakness. Inside, it was simply human. The raids, when they came, were traumatic for everyone present. The police did not knock politely. They broke down doors. They dragged men out of treatment rooms half-dressed. They shouted. They manhandled. They arrested everyone and sorted it out later. Most raids happened late at night, between 10 and midnight, when the establishments were busiest. The police wanted numbers. The more men they arrested, the more impressive the raid looked in the newspapers. The men arrested were taken to the precinct house and held overnight. In the morning, they were brought before a judge. Most were charged with disorderly conduct rather than sodomy, because disorderly conduct was easier to prove. You were in a disreputable place. That was enough. The fine for disorderly conduct was usually $5 to $20, or a few days in jail if you could not pay. Most men paid. Then they were released and told to stay out of trouble. But the arrest record stayed with you. Your name appeared in the police blotter. If your employer found out, you were fired. If your landlord found out, you were evicted. If your family found out, you were disowned. Some men gave false names when arrested. John Smith, William Jones. This worked sometimes, but not always. The police were wise to it and would check for identification. If you were caught lying, the charges escalated. The masseurs who were arrested more frequently and faced harsher charges developed strategies. Some kept bags packed with a change of clothes and bail money, ready to flee if a raid seemed imminent. Some had lawyers on retainer who specialized in these cases. Some simply accepted arrest as an occupational hazard and served their time quietly. Peter van der Meer was arrested 5 times before the final raid that sent him to Blackwell's Island. Each time he gave the same statement. I am a masseur. I provide therapeutic services. I have broken no law. Each time, the charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence. The 5th time, the prosecutor had testimony from an undercover officer who claimed to have solicited and received sexual services from van der Meer. The defense argued the officer was lying, that he had entrapped van der Meer by posing as a client and making the first advance. The jury did not care. Van der Meer was convicted and sentenced to 6 months. Blackwell's Island in the East River was where New York sent its minor criminals, its drunks, its petty thieves, and its sexual deviants. The conditions were brutal: overcrowding, violence, disease. Men arrested for sodomy-related offences were housed with the general population and were frequent targets of assault. Van der Meer survived his 6 months, but he came out different. A friend who knew him before and after told an interviewer years later that Peter was quieter afterward, more watchful, less quick to smile. The island had taken something from him. The aftermath of the major 1896 raid that closed the artistic baths sent ripples through the entire bathhouse network. Other establishments became more cautious. Some closed temporarily. Others changed their operations, becoming more explicitly legitimate and turning away clients who seemed to be seeking anything beyond actual massage. But the demand remained. And where there is demand, supply follows. Within 3 months of the artistic baths closing, 2 new establishments opened. One was on West 32nd Street, operating out of the basement of a hotel. The other was in Greenwich Village, on Bleecker Street, in what had previously been a Turkish coffee house. Both advertised hydrotherapy and Swedish massage. Both attracted the same clientele that had frequented the artistic baths. The cycle was endless. Raid, close, reopen elsewhere. The authorities could disrupt the system, but they could not destroy it. Every closure created an opportunity for someone new. Every arrest taught the survivors how to be more careful. The lessons learned from each raid spread through informal networks. Men talked. Word circulated about which police precincts were more aggressive, which judges were harsher, which lawyers were worth hiring. A body of practical knowledge accumulated. How to minimize risk, how to avoid arrest, how to survive if you were caught. Some of this knowledge was written down, though rarely. One surviving document, found in the papers of a man named Edmund Vance and now held at the New York Public Library, is a handwritten guide titled Advice for Gentlemen Visiting Certain Establishments. It is undated but likely from the late 1890s. The advice is practical and blunt. Never give your real name. Pay in cash and keep no receipts. Do not arrive or leave with another client. Stagger your timing. Do not acknowledge anyone you recognize from these establishments if you see them elsewhere in the city. If questioned by police, say nothing except to request a lawyer. If arrested, pay the fine immediately and leave the city for a few weeks. The document also includes a list of lawyers known to handle these cases discreetly. 3 names appear: Samuel Morrison, Daniel Katz, and Arthur Pembroke. All 3 were real attorneys practicing in New York during this period. Morrison specialized in vice cases. Katz handled a wide range of criminal defense. Pembroke was known for defending unpopular clients and did not care what society thought of him. These lawyers made good money from the bathhouse trade. A typical case, disorderly conduct charge, quick plea deal, cost $25 to $50 in legal fees. For men who could afford it, hiring a lawyer was essential. The lawyer could negotiate with the prosecutor, ensure the client's name stayed out of the newspapers, sometimes get the charges dropped entirely. For men who could not afford a lawyer, Arrest was often catastrophic. They went before a judge alone, pled guilty because they had no other option, paid the fine if they could scrape together the money, and hoped their employer never found out. Many were not that lucky. The intersecting vulnerabilities of class, immigration status, and sexual orientation created a hierarchy of risk. A native-born white man with money and family connections might weather an arrest with minimal damage. An immigrant with no connections and no money could be deported or sent to an asylum. A black man faced even harsher treatment. The criminal justice system was viciously racist, and black men arrested in gay spaces were sentenced more harshly than white men for identical offences. The records are sparse, but the historian Hugh Ryan, in his work on Queer New York, found evidence of this disparity in sentencing data. Between 1890 and 1900, black men arrested on sodomy-related charges received an average sentence 50% longer than white men. They were also far more likely to be sent to hard labour rather than simple incarceration. One case stands out. In 1897, a black masseur named Isaiah Grant was arrested during a raid on a bathhouse in the Tenderloin. He was 26 years old, born in Virginia, had been in New York for 4 years. He was charged with sodomy based on the testimony of an undercover officer. Grant's trial was brief. He had no lawyer. The all-white jury deliberated for less than an hour. He was sentenced to 15 years in Sing Sing, nearly the maximum penalty. White masseurs arrested in the same raid received sentences ranging from probation to 2 years. Isaiah Grant died in Sing Sing in 1904, 7 years into his sentence. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but prison records show he had been in the infirmary repeatedly, with injuries consistent with assault. He was 26 when he went in. He was 33 when he died. He is buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave. His name appears in the records only because his mother, a woman named Clara Grant, wrote letters to the prison warden pleading for his release. She sent 12 letters over 7 years. The warden kept them, probably as evidence of her son's continued moral degradation. They survived in the prison archives. In one letter, dated 1899, she writes, "My son is a good boy. He made a mistake. He has paid for it. Please let him come home. I am old and I need him. Please." The warden did not respond. Clara Grant outlived her son by 3 years. She never saw him again after he was sentenced. This is what the bathhouse world cost some men. Not an evening of pleasure purchased for $3, but everything. Their lives, their freedom, their futures. The cost was not distributed equally. It never is. The women who orbited this world, the Clara Grants, the Clara Gardners, the sisters and mothers and landladies who knew and kept quiet, deserve acknowledgement. They were not part of the gay male community, but they made it possible in small, crucial ways. Some women ran boarding houses that catered to gay men. These were not explicitly advertised as such, but word got around. A boarding house where the landlady did not ask questions, did not care if you had overnight visitors, did not report you to the police. Such places were invaluable. One such landlady was a woman named Margaret O'Hare, who ran a boarding house on West 19th Street from 1888 to 1905. Her tenants were mostly young single men, many of them employees of nearby bathhouses. She charged reasonable rent and minded her own business. When the police came asking questions after raids, Margaret O'Hare claimed to know nothing. Her tenants were quiet and respectable. What they did outside the house was their concern. This willful blindness protected dozens of men over the years. O'Hare was arrested once in 1902 and charged with keeping a disorderly house. The charge was dropped when her tenants testified that the boarding house was perfectly respectable and that Mrs. O'Hare ran a tight ship. The judge accepted this. The police knew better, but could prove nothing. Margaret O'Hare died in 1912. Her obituary in the Times described her as a beloved landlady who had provided homes for hundreds of young men over the years. Several former tenants attended her funeral. They did not explain publicly why they were so devoted to her. They did not need to. There were others. laundresses who washed the linens from bathhouses and never commented on the stains, shopkeepers who sold supplies and never asked why a bathhouse needed so much lavender oil and so many towels, neighbors who heard things through the walls and decided they had not heard anything. Silence was not always complicity. Sometimes it was solidarity. Sometimes it was survival. These women lived in the same tenements, on the same streets, as the men they were protecting. They understood what it meant to be marginalized, to be vulnerable, to need the authorities to look the other way. Their silence was a gift, even if it was never named as such. The immigrant communities that made up so much of Gilded Age New York had complex relationships with the gay men in their midst. In some communities, there was harsh condemnation, religious prohibition, cultural taboo, family honor that could not tolerate sexual deviance. In others, there was quiet acceptance, or at least willful ignorance. The Italian neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan, for example, had a culture of omertà, the code of silence around family business. If a son was gay, the family might not approve, but they did not report him to the authorities. That would bring shame on the family, and shame was worse than almost anything. The Irish communities had their own dynamics. The Catholic Church was brutally clear about homosexuality, mortal sin, hellfire, damnation. But Irish families also had a tradition of protecting their own from outside authorities. The police were not trusted. The courts were not trusted. So if a son was arrested for sodomy, the family might publicly disown him, but privately help him leave the city, start over elsewhere. The Jewish communities varied widely. Orthodox families might completely sever ties with a gay son. But the broader Jewish culture of New York in this era, Reform synagogues, socialist organizations, Yiddish theater, had space for men who did not fit conventional molds. Not open acceptance, but a certain cosmopolitan tolerance. One documented case involves a man named David Rosenberg, a masseur at a bathhouse on the Lower East Side in the late 1890s. Rosenberg was the son of a Jewish tailor. When he was arrested in 1898, his father sat shiva for him, the Jewish mourning ritual for the dead. Officially, David was dead to the family. But David's sister, Sarah, kept in contact. She visited him in jail. She brought him food. She testified as a character witness at his trial, which took enormous courage. She told the court her brother was a good man, who had made mistakes, but did not deserve to be destroyed. David was sentenced to a year in the workhouse. When he was released, Sarah helped him find a job in a garment factory. She vouched for him with the foreman. She gave him a place to stay until he could afford his own room. David Rosenberg lived quietly in New York for another 20 years. He never married. He worked in the garment trade and kept to himself. He died in 1921, age 49, of influenza during the Great Pandemic. Sarah was at his bedside. She had never abandoned him. The funeral was small. Their father did not attend. He had died in 1910, still refusing to acknowledge David. But Sarah was there, and a few of David's friends, and that was enough. This is the other side of the story. Not every family destroyed their gay sons. Not every community turned its back. Some people stood by each other. Some people chose love over shame. Those stories are rarer in the archives, but they existed. The economic model of the bathhouses evolved over time. By 1900, some establishments were experimenting with membership systems. You paid an annual fee, $25 or $50, and received unlimited access. This created a stable income stream for the owners and ensured loyalty from clients. The membership model also provided cover. If questioned by police, the owner could point to the membership rolls and claim this was a private club, not a public accommodation. Private clubs had more legal protection. The police needed a warrant to raid them, which was harder to obtain. The Everard adopted a membership system in 1899. The membership card was a small brass token with a number stamped on it. No names, just numbers. You showed your token at the door and were admitted. The tokens were transferable. If you wanted to bring a friend, you could loan your token, though this was officially discouraged. This system created a sense of exclusivity. You were not just a customer, you were a member. You belonged. For men who belonged nowhere else, this mattered. The Everard's membership grew to over 300 by 1900. That is 300 men in New York who were part of a gay social network substantial enough to sustain a membership-based bathhouse. 300 men who were willing to pay $50 a year for access to a safe space. That number is astonishing when you consider the risks. Joining meant putting your name, or at least your money, on a list that could be seized in a raid. But the benefits outweighed the risks. The Everard was raided periodically, but the membership rolls were kept in code and were never successfully used to prosecute members. The culture at the Everard by 1900 was different from the artistic baths in the early 1890s. The Everard was larger, more established, more confident. It had a social calendar. Thursday evenings were reportedly the busiest, drawing a younger crowd. Sunday afternoons were quieter, attracting older regulars who wanted conversation more than anything else. There were informal rules about behavior. No public sex in the common areas. If you wanted privacy, you rented a cubicle. The steam room was for socializing, not for overt sexual activity. This distinction was important. It allowed the Everard to maintain a veneer of respectability while still serving its true purpose. The owners of the Everard family, were straight as far as anyone knew. They saw it as a business. They were not activists. They were not allies in any political sense. They were entrepreneurs who identified a market and served it. But in doing so, they created something important. They created continuity. The Everard survived where others failed because the owners were cautious, professional, and consistent. They paid their bribes on time. They kept the building clean and well maintained. They hired competent staff. They built a brand. And that brand endured for decades. By 1900, going to the Everard was not an act of desperation. It was routine. Men spoke about it in coded terms, but they spoke about it. A friend might tell a friend casually that he had been to the 28th Street place, and the friend would know exactly what he meant. This normalization, fragile as it was, represented a shift. The bathhouses were no longer hidden secrets known only to a desperate few. They were institutions, part of the landscape of gay New York. You could be new to the city, ask around carefully, and within a few weeks you would know where to go. The knowledge was accessible. This did not mean safety. Men were still arrested. Lives were still destroyed. But the infrastructure existed. That mattered. The turn of the century brought changes. The city was modernizing. Electric lights were replacing gas. Telephones were becoming common. The subway was under construction. New York was becoming a 20th century metropolis, and the gay underworld modernized with it. Some bathhouses installed electric lighting, which was brighter and harsher than gas. This was not an improvement for discretion. So many kept gas lamps in the private rooms while using electric lights in public areas. Telephones allowed for appointments to be made in advance. Instead of just showing up and hoping your preferred masseur was available, you could call ahead. Of course, you could not say much over the phone. Operators listened in and phone lines were not secure. But you could say, I would like to make an appointment for Thursday evening at 8, and that was enough. Some establishments began advertising in coded personal ads in newspapers. The language was careful. A typical ad might read, Swedish massage, private sessions, discerning gentlemen only, by appointment. The word discerning was code. It signaled that this was not for everyone. You had to know what you were looking for. These ads appeared in mainstream newspapers, the Times, the Herald, the World. They were buried in the back pages among other personal services, but they were there, hiding in plain sight. The police mostly ignored them. Shutting down every bathhouse in New York was impossible, and everyone knew it. The enforcement strategy became more targeted. Go after the most visible places, the ones that attracted complaints, the ones that were too brazen. Leave the discreet ones alone. This created an incentive for discretion. The bathhouses that survived longest were the ones that did not draw attention. No loud music, no drunk clients stumbling out at midnight, no fights, no scandals, quiet, professional, invisible. The Everard mastered this. It operated for 90 years, from 1888 to 1977, outlasting every other gay bathhouse in New York. That longevity was not accidental. It was the result of careful management, strategic bribes, and an understanding that survival meant staying just below the threshold of what the authorities would tolerate. Other establishments were less careful. A bathhouse on the Bowery called the Atlantic operated for only 2 years before being shut down permanently in 1901. The problem was not that it was gay, the problem was that it was rowdy. Clients fought. Police were called repeatedly for noise complaints. Neighbors petitioned to have it closed. The owner, a man named Frank Sullivan, tried to clean up the operation, but it was too late. The authorities had decided the Atlantic was a nuisance, and nuisances got closed. Sullivan lost his investment and left the city. The lesson was clear. You could run a gay bathhouse in New York, but you had to run it well. You had to manage your clients. You had to keep the neighbors happy. You had to pay the right people. And you had to accept that at any moment, for reasons beyond your control, it could all come crashing down. That precarity shaped everything. The owners made money, but could not invest long-term. The staff built skills, but could not rely on stable employment. The clients found community, but could not take it for granted. Everything was temporary. Everything was fragile. And yet, it endured. The turn into the 20th century marked a subtle but significant shift in how gay men navigated New York. The city's population had reached 3.5 million by 1900. Immigration continued to pour bodies into the tenements. The anonymity that allowed the bathhouse culture to flourish deepened even further. A young man arriving at Ellis Island in 1900 could step off the boat, process through the immigration hall, take a ferry to Manhattan, and within a week find his way to a bathhouse. The network was that established. The knowledge circulated that efficiently. You did not need to know someone personally anymore. You just needed to know where to listen. Certain cafes became known as places where information could be gathered. A restaurant on Bleecker Street called the Black Rabbit was one such place. It served ordinary food to ordinary customers, but it also served as an informal clearinghouse for gay knowledge. Men who knew would sit at certain tables. New arrivals who were observant would notice patterns, catch glances, begin conversations. The historian Chad Heap documented this kind of informal networking in his work on early 20th century queer urban culture. He describes how entire systems of communication existed beneath the surface of the city, invisible to outsiders, but highly functional for those who knew how to read the signs. A folded newspaper left on a particular table, a flower worn in a particular lapel, a question asked in a particular way. These were not passwords exactly. They were shibboleths, ways of identifying yourself and being identified without speaking directly. The bathhouses benefited from this underground communication network. They did not need to advertise aggressively because word of mouth did the work. A new establishment could open and within 2 weeks have a steady clientele, simply because the information spread through channels the owners never saw. This organic growth created resilience. When one bathhouse closed, another opened, sometimes in the exact same building. The locations became known independent of who ran them. Men would say the place on 23rd Street or the basement spot near Union Square, and everyone knew what they meant, even if the ownership had changed 3 times. By 1905, there were at least 15 bathhouses operating in Manhattan that catered primarily or exclusively to gay men. This is a conservative estimate based on police records, newspaper accounts, and the fragmentary personal diaries that survived. The real number was probably higher. Some operated so discreetly they left no trace in the historical record. These 15 establishments varied widely. Some were elaborate, like the Everard, with its multiple floors and swimming pool. Others were modest. A few rooms above a shop, a masseur working alone, appointments by referral only. The smallest operations were often the safest. A masseur named Thomas Chen, an immigrant from China, ran a one-man operation out of a Chinatown apartment from roughly 1898 to 1910. He advertised traditional Chinese massage in the Chinese-language newspapers. His clients were almost entirely white gay men who had learned about him through whisper networks. Chen was arrested once, in 1903, when a client was robbed leaving his building and the police investigated everyone in the tenement. The client refused to press charges or identify Chen as the person he had been visiting. The police had nothing. Chen was released. He continued working for another 7 years. The historian Nyan Shah, in his research on queer Asian communities in early America, found references to Chen in several personal letters written by gay men in New York during this period. They describe him as kind, skilled, and utterly trustworthy. One letter writer called him a gift in a city that gives gay men very little. Thomas Chen disappeared from the records in 1910. We do not know if he died, returned to China, or simply moved. But for 12 years, he provided a service that men desperately needed, and he did it with dignity and care. The economics of sex work and intimacy work, because that is what this was, have always been complicated by morality and law. The men who worked as masseurs occupied a status somewhere between service worker and criminal, and that ambiguity shaped their lives in profound ways. Some masseurs saw the work as purely economic, a job, a way to make rent. They were not gay themselves, or if they were, they did not identify that way. They provided a service in exchange for money and did not think much about the larger meaning. Others saw it differently. For gay masseurs, the work was more than transaction. It was a way to be close to other gay men, a way to participate in a community, a way to feel less alone. The money mattered, but it was not the only thing that mattered. One masseur, identified only as EM, in a letter preserved at the Kinsey Institute, wrote in 1904, "I know what my work looks like from the outside. I know what the priests would call it. But when I hold another man and he relaxes into my touch, when I see the fear leave his face and something like peace arrive, I am doing something good. I have to believe that. Otherwise, I could not live with myself." That is as clear a statement of purpose as we are going to find. EM was not defending sex work in abstract political terms. He was saying, this work has value. The comfort I provide is real. The connection is real. And in a world that tells gay men they are worthless, helping them feel worthy, even for an hour, even for money, is not nothing. The relationships that formed between masseurs and clients were sometimes transactional and sometimes not. The longer a client returned to the same masseur, the more likely something deeper developed. Not always romance, though sometimes that. More often, friendship, trust, a sense of mutual recognition. George Merritt, in his confession, describes this evolution. He visited the same masseur, a man named Edward, for over 2 years. The first few visits were purely physical, but over time, they began to talk. Edward told him about his life, his family back in Ireland, his hopes to save enough money to open a shop. Merritt told Edward about his work, his loneliness, his fear of dying alone. Merritt writes, "Edward became the only person in my life who knew the truth about me. He knew I was a coward. He knew I was lonely. He knew I wanted things I could never have. And he did not judge me. He listened. That listening was worth more than anything physical that happened between us." When Edward left New York in 1896, he had saved enough to return to Ireland. Merritt went to the docks to see him off. They shook hands. They did not embrace. That would have drawn attention. But Merritt writes that he stood on the dock and watched the ship disappear and felt like he had lost something he would never get back. He was right. He never found another masseur he trusted the way he trusted Edward. He visited other bathhouses, other men, but it was never the same. The intimacy was gone. It was just transaction again. Merritt died by suicide 8 months later. That is the shape of many of these stories. Connection, loss, unbearable loneliness, and then an ending that feels inevitable in retrospect, but was not. These men were not doomed by their sexuality. They were doomed by a society that gave them no place to exist. If Merritt had been born a century later, he might have had a husband. He might have had a community. He might have grown old. Instead, he got 2 years of stolen intimacy with a masseur named Edward, and then he got nothing. That is what the bathhouses were trying to solve. Not just sexual desire, though, that was part of it, but the soul-crushing isolation of being gay in a world that wanted you invisible. The bathhouses said, "You are not invisible here. You exist. You matter. You can be touched without shame." It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it was something. And something, for many men, was the difference between surviving and not surviving. The legal and cultural environment began to shift slightly in the first decade of the 20th century, though not in ways that necessarily helped gay men. The progressive era brought new moral reform movements, social purity crusades, campaigns against vice of all kinds, prostitution, gambling, alcohol, and sexual deviance. These movements were led primarily by women, many of them genuinely concerned about exploitation and public health. But their focus on cleaning up the city's moral landscape made life harder for everyone operating in grey areas, including the bathhouses. The Committee of 14, formed in 1905, was a private citizens group dedicated to investigating and shutting down vice operations in New York. They hired investigators to visit suspect establishments, gather evidence, and report to the police. Several bathhouses were investigated by the Committee of 14. The reports are preserved in the New York Public Library archives. They make for disturbing reading. The investigators were instructed to pose as clients, enter the bathhouses, and document what they observed. One investigator, in a report dated 1907, describes visiting a bathhouse on West 30th Street. He was shown to a private room. A masseur entered and offered a standard massage. The investigator then, according to his report, made a suggestive remark to see how the masseur would respond. The masseur asked him to leave, said this was a legitimate establishment and he needed to go. The investigator reported this as evidence that the bathhouse was screening customers and refusing service to those who might be law enforcement or troublemakers. The Committee of 14 used this report to argue that the bathhouse was clearly operating with knowledge of illegal activity, even though the masseur had refused to engage. This is the impossible position these establishments were in. If they provided sexual services, they were guilty. If they refused to provide sexual services, they were also guilty because the refusal implied they knew what was illegal. The Committee of 14 succeeded in shutting down several bathhouses between 1905 and 1910. But like the police raids before, the effect was temporary. The bathhouses reopened under new names or in new locations. The cycle continued. By 1910, the geography of gay New York had expanded. The bathhouses were still concentrated below 42nd Street, but new clusters were appearing. Harlem was beginning to develop a gay scene, though it would not fully flower until the 1920s. Greenwich Village was attracting artists, bohemians, and sexual nonconformists of all kinds. The village in particular became a haven for gay men who wanted something more than the bathhouses offered. Cafes where you could sit and talk openly, or at least more openly than elsewhere. Rooming houses where landladies did not care who you brought home. Speakeasies that catered to mixed crowds. Gay, straight, everything in between. The bathhouses in the village tended to be smaller and more intimate than the large operations like the Everard. They attracted a younger, more bohemian crowd. Artists, writers, men who were starting to think about homosexuality not just as something to hide, but as an identity. This was the beginning of a shift that would take decades to fully unfold. The idea that being gay was not just something you did in secret, but something you were, publicly, unapologetically. The bathhouses had been about hiding. The village was starting to be about visibility, but in 1910, that visibility was still dangerous. The men who gathered in village cafes still used coded language. They still risked arrest. They still lost jobs and families when they were discovered. The difference was that they were beginning to find each other not just for sex, but for solidarity. The bathhouses played a role in this larger shift. They had been the first spaces where gay men could reliably find each other. They had created networks. They had proven that gay community was possible, even if that community existed only in stolen hours behind locked doors. As the century progressed, other spaces opened up, but the bathhouses remained. They were the foundation, the original safe space, the place where men had learned they were not alone. The historians who study this era, George Chauncey, Chad Heap, Hugh Ryan, Michael Bronsky, all emphasize that the bathhouse culture was not a sideshow to gay history. It was central. It was where modern gay urban life began. Before the bathhouses, gay men were isolated individuals. After the bathhouses, they were a community, fragmented, hidden, vulnerable, but real. And from that community, everything else followed. The bathhouses also preserved memory. This is harder to quantify, but no less important. The men who worked in the bathhouses and the men who visited them carried knowledge forward. They told younger men what they had learned, where to go, how to stay safe, what the risks were, what the joys were. This oral tradition was the only archive gay men had for most of history. The written record was sparse because writing things down was evidence, but memory persisted. Stories were passed from one generation to the next. An older man who had visited the artistic baths in the 1890s might, in 1920, tell a younger man about how it had been, what the rooms looked like, who worked there, what happened when the police raided. The younger man would carry that knowledge forward and tell someone else in 1940. This is how gay history survived before there were books and archives and museums, through storytelling, through the deliberate act of refusing to let the past be forgotten. The bathhouses were part of that storytelling tradition. They were where the stories were told, where older men mentored younger ones, not formally but through presence and example, where you learned how to navigate a world that wanted you dead by watching men who had survived. By the 1910s, some of the men who had been young masseurs in the 1890s were now middle-aged and running their own establishments. They had learned from Charles Gardner and others like him. They knew how to manage the risks. They knew how to build something that could last. Peter van der Meer, after his release from Blackwell's Island and his years as a tailor, eventually returned to the bathhouse world. Records suggest he was working as a manager at a bathhouse in the Bronx by 1910. Not a masseur anymore. He was in his 40s by then, but in an administrative role, handling the books, managing staff, using everything he had learned to help a new generation of young men survive the same system that had tried to destroy him. He was still there in 1915, according to a city directory. Then the trail goes cold. We do not know when he died or where he is buried. But for at least 25 years, Peter van der Meer was part of the bathhouse world. He gave it most of his adult life. He survived long enough to see the culture he had helped build become permanent. That is worth something. The human cost of the bathhouse era is impossible to calculate. We know the names of a few dozen men from court records and newspaper accounts. We can guess at a few hundred more from fragmentary sources. But the real number of men whose lives were shaped by these establishments runs into the thousands. How many men found comfort they could not have found elsewhere? How many found love? How many found friendship? How many survived another year because they had one place where they could be honest about who they were? And how many were destroyed? How many were arrested, imprisoned, deported, institutionalized, driven to suicide? How many lost everything because they walked through a door looking for connection? Both realities are true. The bathhouses saved some men and ruined others, sometimes the same men at different points in their lives. What is undeniable is that these men deserved better. They deserved a world where they did not have to hide. where they did not have to pay for intimacy because free intimacy was too dangerous, where they did not have to live double lives that fractured their souls. They did not get that world. They got the world they had. And in that world, they built what they could. They created spaces. They took care of each other as much as circumstances allowed. They survived. That survival is its own form of resistance. Every man who walked into a bathhouse and walked out again was refusing the world's insistence that he should not exist. Every masseur who kept working despite the arrests was insisting that gay men deserved comfort and care. Every owner who reopened after a raid was saying, "You cannot erase us." The bathhouses of Gilded Age New York were not utopias. They were commercial enterprises operating in a profoundly unjust legal and social system. They were shaped by capitalism, by class inequality, by racism, by all the forces that make the world cruel. But they were also places where men held each other, where they laughed together, where they told each other the truth, where they survived, and survival, in a world that wanted them dead, was everything. The massage parlors and bathhouses are mostly gone now. The Everard burned in 1977, killing 9 men. The building stood empty for years after, a monument to loss. It was finally torn down in the 1980s. The site is now a luxury apartment building. The residents have no idea what once stood there. The artistic baths, Charles Gardner's brownstone on East 23rd Street, was demolished in 1932 to make way for an office building. That building is still there. People walk past it every day, rushing to work, thinking about their own lives, completely unaware that a century ago, men risked everything just to touch each other in rooms upstairs. Most of the other locations are similarly erased, buildings torn down or repurposed. The geography is lost. The only markers are in archives, in fading newspaper clippings, in trial transcripts that no one reads. But the legacy persists. The bathhouse culture that began in Gilded Age New York spread across the country. By the 1970s, every major American city had gay bathhouses. They were still controversial. They were still raided, but they existed openly in a way that would have been unimaginable in 1890. The AIDS crisis of the 1980s devastated the bathhouse world. Many were closed by health authorities. Others closed voluntarily as the community grappled with how to stop the dying. The culture shifted. What had been liberation became, for a time, death. But some survived, and new ones opened. The bathhouse as a gay institution did not die. It adapted, it changed, but it remained. Because the need it filled, the need for space, for touch, for community, for a place to be fully yourself, that need did not disappear. It is still here. It will always be here as long as the world makes it hard to be gay. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about those men, the ones who climbed the stairs on 23rd Street, the ones who paid $3 for an hour of not being alone, the ones who were arrested and destroyed and forgotten. Think about Peter Vandermeer, who went to jail rather than betray his clients. Think about Theodore Ames, who wrote in his diary that he was tired and then took laudanum and did not wake up. Think about Isaiah Grant, who died in prison at 33 for the crime of being black and gay and poor. Think about Clara Gardner, who stood by her brother when the world condemned him. Think about Margaret O'Hare, who rented rooms to gay men and lied to the police to protect them. Think about the women who washed the sheets and kept the secrets and made the whole fragile system possible. Think about George Merritt and Edward, who shook hands on a dock because they could not embrace, and how Merritt watched the ship disappear, knowing he would never see Edward again. These were real people. They lived. They loved. They suffered. They survived as long as they could. The world gave them almost nothing. They built something anyway. They built spaces where they could breathe, where they could be seen, where they could touch and be touched without shame, even if only for an hour, even if they had to pay for it, even if the police might come crashing through the door at any moment. They built community in the cracks of a society that wanted them invisible. They passed knowledge to each other in whispers. They kept each other's secrets. They mourned each other when the world would not. And they did all of this without any promise that it would get better, without any guarantee that future generations would even know they had existed. But we know. We found the trial transcripts and the diaries and the letters tied with red thread in wooden boxes. We pieced the story together from fragments. We said their names out loud because they could not. Peter Vandermeer, Theodore Ames, Isaiah Grant, George Merritt, David Rosenberg, Thomas Chen, Charles Gardiner, Edward, whose last name we never learned, E.M., who believed he was doing something good. They mattered. Their lives mattered. Their love mattered. Their survival mattered. You exist because they existed. You get to live openly because they lived in hiding. You get to hold hands in public because they paid $3 to touch each other in secret. The line between their world and yours is not as long as it feels. Your grandfather was alive when the Everard was still operating. Your great-grandfather might have been alive when Charles Gardiner climbed out of Sing Sing and started over in San Francisco. This history is not ancient. It is recent. It is still breathing. The last men who remembered the bathhouses of the Gilded Age died in the 1970s and 1980s. They carried those memories to their graves. They told what stories they could before they died. We owe them remembrance. We owe them the dignity of being included in history, not as footnotes or scandals, but as people who lived and mattered. So tonight, in the quiet, say thank you. To the men who built the first safe spaces when there were none. To the men who loved each other when love was a crime. To the men who survived, and to the men who did not survive, but who tried. They walked through doors that could destroy them because the alternative, living an entire life without ever being touched, without ever being seen, was worse than the risk. That is courage. That is love. That is what it took to survive as a gay man in Gilded Age New York. And they did survive. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough. Enough to pass something forward. Enough to create the fragile thread that connects them to you. You are that thread's continuation. You are proof that they were not erased, that the bathhouses mattered, that the love mattered, that the survival mattered. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams be free of police raids and puritanical judges and societies that punish love. May you wake tomorrow in a world where no one has to hide who they are to survive. May you remember the men who did not have that world, but who built what they could with what they had. Good night, and sleep well.